Pakistan is partially responsible, not for primarily causing or exacerbating climate change, but for its own lack of climate-resilient infrastructure in place to tackle these climate-induced catastrophes.
More than 30 billion in economic losses for a country like Pakistan. It's just not possible for Pakistan to mobilize those numbers within itself. But I will not absolve Pakistan of its own responsibility as well.
And fossil fuels, just by itself, it comprises 86% of primary commercial energy use. And just the transition to cleaner energy has been estimated to cost $101 billion. And these numbers are inconceivable.
This urbanization in centers like Lahore, Karachi have been the major cause of loss of vegetation, caused a number of environmental problems like air pollution.
Agricultural yields are expected to drop by 50% by 2050.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Nauraiz Rana, and I'm an economist for the World Bank. Today, I have with me two subject matter experts on the topic of climate change. I'll first begin by introducing Ms. Sundus Siddiqi. She's a climate change specialist working at the World Bank, and she focuses on climate adaptation and coastal resilience. Thank you for joining us, Sundus.
Hi, Nauraiz. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Secondly, we have Ms. Nimra Hayat. She's an environmental engineer come data scientist working with Amazon and helping them achieve their net zero carbon goals by 2040. Thank you for joining us, Nimra.
Hey, excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So as all of you must have rightly guessed, today we'll be speaking about climate change and the catastrophe that Pakistan recently went through less than a year ago. So without further ado, I'll dive right in. Climate change, arguably, or actually not even arguably, it is the single biggest threat that the world is facing at the moment. It is a risk multiplier, and the impacts are not just limited to extreme weather situations and weather conditions, but they also encompass and they tend to aggravate food systems, food scarcity. They tend to cause water insecurity, they cause displacement, they're leading to refugee crisis, they're leading to conflicts within countries. And there's also a very strong correlation between climate change and inflation, and it's pushing people into poverty. It is, I guess, and everything is happening right now. It's not something in the future. We're living through these crises. And we don't need to look elsewhere, like I just mentioned. We look at the events of last year. Pakistan underwent extreme weather conditions. Initially, there was a heat wave. That was a 1 in 1,000-year event where continuously we saw temperatures rise on average above 45 degrees Celsius. And then there were unprecedented levels of monsoon rains, which led to disruptions, which actually led to complete disruption of assets, lives, livelihoods. 1/3 of the country was submerged underwater. 33 million people were impacted. Many, unfortunately, died. And these are huge numbers. These are greater than even the most populous countries in the world. Let's say we're talking about Mumbai, or let's say we're talking about Karachi, is the entire areas, entire population just completely wiped off and displaced. So it really begs the question. It begs actually a lot of questions. Why is this happening in Pakistan? Pakistan, sadly, is among the top 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change. Why is that so? Is that just nature's curse? Is that where we are geographically located? Is it the topography? Is it the making of our own policies or our own actions? Or is it a global phenomenon? So Nimra, I'll first turn to you to just weigh in a bit briefly on the science behind why all this is happening, and is Pakistan responsible?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nauraiz. So let me start by answering whether Pakistan is to be blamed or not for the flooding that occurred last year. It's not a straightforward yes or no answer, in my opinion. Yes, Pakistan is partially responsible, not for primarily causing or exacerbating climate change, but for its own lack of climate-resilient infrastructure in place to tackle these climate-induced catastrophes that they're experiencing, right? Especially since climate change models had been predicting more intense rainfalls and weather events in countries like Pakistan, Pakistan should have been more prepared. I'll dive more into this later. Before jumping into that, let me just share very, very high level, why this phenomena is occurring. To begin, life on Earth depends on energy coming from the sun, right? Animals, plants, land, and ocean absorb the solar energy needed to survive. They absorb what's needed and reflect the rest of that back into space. That's kind of how nature is supposed to be working. Pre-industrialization, nature was in balance. This excess heat was being radiated back into space. CO2 and methane are naturally occurring gases in the atmosphere, and they were somewhat at manageable levels. However, post-industrialization and burning of fossil fuels, it created an imbalance in this process. And we started releasing more and more carbon into the atmosphere. CO2 concentration, methane concentrations multiplied, and greenhouse gases essentially formed a blanket around the Earth. And they started trapping the sun's heat instead of letting it go back into the stratosphere. This has essentially led to warming of our planet. We are at 1.1 degrees Celsius higher temperature compared to pre-industrial era. So what's happening with this? What are the effects of this global warming? As more heat-trapping gases are getting pumped into the atmosphere, planet temperature will increase, more water will evaporate from the oceans, hotter air tends to hold more moisture as well. So all of this will lead to extreme weather-related events like flooding. This will lead to more heat waves, like the one that Europe experienced. More mega droughts will occur, something that California has been experiencing over the last few years. There will be crop failures, species extinction, food production will be impacted, water insecurity will rise. So overall, these are the effects of climate change, and that is what we're seeing in countries like Pakistan and elsewhere as well.
Okay, so basically it is a global phenomena, and I guess the key takeaway from your description is the fact that countries who are higher ahead in the trajectory in terms of industrialization, who embarked upon that, that trajectory, that journey back in the 18th, 19th centuries, they are and should be more responsible, and they've contributed towards greater carbon emissions. High-income countries much more industrialized than those such as Pakistan, and nations which are still at the moment in the developing phase. So when you're talking about adapting to these climatic and global changes, obviously there's a need of investment, and countries like Pakistan, who are already facing a financial crunch, they're in the midst of various economic issues. And I'm just looking at the numbers in front of me. The recent floods of 2022, they led to damages accruing a total of $14.9 billion. Additionally, on top of that, the economic losses were estimated to be 15.2 billion. And the estimates as per the World Bank for rehabilitation and resilient construction was around 16.3 billion. So for a country which is at the moment is negotiating for deals as little as $1 billion, it is practically impossible for them to come up with these sources of financing that would help them deal with the impacts and the repercussions of climate change, which is a global phenomenon. And Pakistan being a country which is contributing less than 1% of carbon emissions towards the global cap, I believe it is right to assume that they should not be held responsible. On that note, I would pivot the discussion towards you, Sundus, and really ask you, what are multilateral organizations, what are these high-income countries doing in terms of for not compensating the losses, but ensuring that climate justice is being done, because many countries are paying the prices of the actions that they had embarked upon many years ago, decades ago, centuries ago. Our foreign minister, Pakistan's foreign minister, Govt Bhutto Zardari, is actually advocating the same. He talks about climate reparation. He's going from one country to the other, and he's putting forth this agenda, this discussion, that this responsibility should be more shared, or actually the burden should be borne by countries who contributed towards this catastrophe. So Sundus, what are your viewpoints? What is being done on the climate financing front? What more can be done, and how important is it for these countries to acknowledge the events that are happening elsewhere in the world?
Thank you, Nauraiz. This is an incredibly sensitive and complicated issue because climate change is very, very unique in the sense that it not only is impacting developing countries like Pakistan in a manner, even within Pakistan, the impacts aren't felt equally across the whole society. So the poorest and most marginalized, such as you can think of small farmers, rural communities, women, elderly, they are often the ones who bear the brunt of the climate change the most. And they're also the ones that are least protected from the impacts of climate change. So definitely this is a big issue of climate justice, and efforts to promote climate justice have been generally on the rise in the global community. In fact, one of the major impetuses of the 2015 climate conference in Paris was to address this, where world leaders came together to commit US $100 billion annually to combat climate change. Now, in reality, I believe only a fraction of that amount has been mobilized. One other point to note is that often in the context of global climate finance flows, climate mitigation is seen as a global public good. It is seen as exactly the science that Nimra just laid out, that when one country or one set of countries is emitting, another set of countries is also facing the brunt of that. So keeping that in mind, climate mitigation was often touted as being the key global public good that needed investment. And a lot of work has gone into supporting renewable investments, for instance, supporting other countries to move towards a low carbon pathway. It's only very recently, in very recent years, and Pakistan has come as a really big example with the most recent floods, that now the international community needs to step in for climate adaptation as well. The numbers that you mentioned, I mean, more than 30 billion in economic losses for a country like Pakistan, it's just not possible for Pakistan to mobilize those numbers within itself. But I will not absolve Pakistan of its own responsibility as well. So definitely stressing the point that we, as Pakistanis, need foreign direct investment to not only a one-off event. We will need sustained flows in order to support the communities, in order to support people-centric climate adaptation, which is also something that's a little bit different from the way the international community has thought of climate adaptation in the past. But within Pakistan, we will also need to be receptive. We will need to have a financial system. We need to have a systematic response to this. We need to align our financial flows to go where they're needed most. We will also need to mobilize domestic revenue, whether that comes from taxes, how that's done, that's a separate story. But we need to improve the efficiency and the targeting of our investments that go towards climate change. And then we as South Asia, especially countries around the Indus Basin, will need to come together because we have very similar risks when it comes to natural disasters. And if we are able to set up a system where we can pool in our human resources, our technological resources, our financial resources, I think we will be able to kind of hedge the risks that are coming up from climate change in a better way.
Thank you. So I think what we're trying to say, and it actually makes sense, is the fact that though Pakistan may not be contributing to climate change, but the way that the catastrophe is handled, the way putting the population in, when designing, putting the person in front of the policy is very imperative, because again, the adverse impacts, the negative impacts, and the issues are being faced solely by populations. Again, it's spatially very diverse. The impacts that are being felt by, let's say, people in interior Sindh, as we witnessed during the floodings of 2022, are vastly different for those who are, dwelling in more urban areas, such as in Lahore, such as in Islamabad, for instance. So coming to that point again, I'll circle back to you, Nimra. Sundus rightly pointed out that we cannot really absolve Pakistan of the responsibility or even of the blame. Pakistan, again, while in terms of proportion may not be contributing enough towards global carbon emission, but still there are sectors which are not carbon friendly, which are not climate friendly, sorry. They are very carbon intensive. And you recently published a paper drawing some correlations among what are the driving factors where Pakistan can improve, finding again, the relationship between areas, sectors, industries that tend to further exacerbate the impacts of climate change. So could you just highlight what were your key findings?
Yeah, definitely. That's a very good point on this, what you just mentioned. While, of course, Pakistan may not be a big contributor to global warming, it is on an upward trajectory of releasing carbon emissions, adversely impacting its own regional environment. So there are environmental changes that we are experiencing within the country, within our own borders because of this phenomena. So to your point, Nauraiz, I did analyze and publish an article around this. I took the data from the World Bank Development Indicators dataset, WDI dataset, and as part of my findings, I found that Pakistan is heavily reliant on dirty fuels like coal, natural gas for generating power, which is the main source of carbon emissions today. Manufacturing industries' emissions are also releasing more carbon into our atmosphere. Emissions from the combustion of fuel, from transport activity, from our residential buildings, our homes has been on the rise since 2010, which is also partly due to population growth. So total population has been on the rise, and there was a direct correlation with the CO2 emissions that we've seen over the years, a very high positive correlation between the two factors. This population growth, of course, leads to an increasing consumption of fossil fuel generated services and products, which further releases more carbon into the air. What happens then is that with little kind of economic opportunity in our country found in rural parts of the nation, most residents tend to move to major urban centers to, of course, provide for their families, which is leading to unprecedented, very high urbanization rates. This urbanization in centers like Lahore, Karachi have been the major cause of loss of vegetation, caused a number of environmental problems like air pollution. Lahore has been on, I guess, has had the worst air pollution over the past few years. This leads to water scarcity. There's loss of biodiversity. All in all, more people will lead to more consumption, more cars on the roads, more pollution, causing more emissions. So, of course, there is lack of urban planning, there is mismanagement of resources. But I think looking at this data, policymakers should definitely start to analyze what is happening, what the current state of affairs is, and addressing the biggest actors at play to meet our emission reduction targets. For example, what specifically to flooding that occurred, I think our country needs to build a flood control infrastructure, such as tide gates, to just prevent the rising of water. Another example would be in California, scientists are working on recharging the state's severely depleted groundwater by diverting excessive water into fields and letting the water seep into aquifers, which is something that Pakistan should also consider. Communities should be moved off the floodplain industrial river floodplain and to higher ground to avoid, of course, the impacts. So definitely, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So just to your point, so I think what I see is two major themes that are brewing out of our discussion. One is the fact that though Pakistan is contributing in terms of carbon emissions towards the global tally, but it may not be triggering global climatic events. But at the same time, its actions are impeding the local environment in terms of air pollution. And then to Sundus's point that, when we're looking at the impacts that people are undergoing through, that they're experiencing, the government and the policymakers are failing to address those. They could act preemptively. They could employ the right set of mechanisms in terms of infrastructure, in terms of disaster and risk management, rehabilitation, that would at least alleviate all the various problems that people tend to go through. And those are not smaller problems. They are literally, like we earlier established, that they're disrupting livelihoods. So on that note, another question for you, Sundus, given that you're working on coastal resilience, you're working on climate adaptation, what are some of the areas and how can Pakistan adapt? A, in terms of the climate change that is happening, and B, on the implicit effects of climate change. That is, it is leading to water scarcity. Water is a huge, huge issue. The food agriculture nexus in Pakistan, it is both a product and a contributor to climate change. There are other industrial sectors, the energy sectors. How do you think, what are some of the areas where Pakistan has the ability to really optimize and adapt towards the transition towards more climate-friendly growth, climate-friendly policies?
Thank you, Nauraiz. So Pakistan is at a very critical juncture. I think now is exactly the time where we either rapidly scale up our investments in climate action, or we'll be facing even more devastating impacts in the years to come. And I say this because no matter which model, which climate model you pick up, it shows Pakistan is having an above average warming than the world. So when Pakistan's best case scenario is the worst case scenario for most of the world, that is really a call to action for Pakistan to kind of see what they need to do. Like Nimra mentioned, our infrastructure is not adequately robust. So we need to invest in our infrastructure and make sure that the 1 in 100-year events that are now becoming 1 in 10-year events that are now becoming so commonplace, we're able to respond to that. We need to have a systematic response. And this won't come from the few centers that are working on climate change. This will come only when climate change is treated as a development issue and is cross-cutting throughout. So this is a social protection issue. This is a health issue. This is an infrastructure issue. It's an economic issue. In terms of adaptation, I think while the NDMA, so our National Disaster Management Authority, has really done a lot in the past years to kind of respond more effectively, that is where I would start to improve our response mechanisms further, to work with the Pakistan Met Department to actually be able to anticipate these extreme weather events and give the appropriate warnings. So people who need to evacuate, people who need to respond, they have the time to do so. So this is immediate recovery and response that I'm talking about. But then we need to have really a systematic grassroots community-led response, which will then incorporate all the sectors that we've already discussed in this conversation. We get a lot of humanitarian assistance as well, but it's always in the aftermath of such an event. So again, some sort of a systematic financial mechanism would also be super useful.
I just to further your point, and you can continue, I just wanted to add something which came to my knowledge, that Pakistan in 2021, they prepared a nationally determined contribution report, a robust report, and that was presented at COP26, mainstreaming decarbonization, resilience, and green growth. And the figures that I wanted to point out that are in front of me are that it is estimated that by 2030, the total cost needed to achieve these mainstreaming decarbonization goals is accumulating $200 billion. And just the transition to cleaner energy has been estimated to cost $101 billion. And these numbers are inconceivable. For a country like Pakistan, it is, we are continually accruing more debt, accruing more loss. The fiscal deficits are growing. So it is practically impossible for a country of this stature to find the investment internally of such high numbers. And back to your point, and please continue, that you said that financing these needs, the larger community does need to share the greater responsibility and come in. But on the policy side, I think there are gaps that Pakistan needs to fill in so that the environment is conducive enough for greater receptiveness to climate finance. Correct.
For instance, Nauraiz, you mentioned the energy sector and also with the agriculture sector, which is, these are the two major sectors of Pakistan apart from infrastructure. Both of them have really environmentally damaging subsidies. So this would be another thing where we do an internal reckoning to see that how can we move away from fossil fuels? How can we remove these subsidies to make our energy sector more efficient, to reduce those transmission and distribution losses, which will not only, have mitigation co-benefits, but will also be good for our energy robustness. And one thing that we don't even think about is energy resilience. The fact that we, in this day and age, even with the higher investment that we've done in past years in the energy sector, still have so much load shedding, still our grid isn't reliable. So we need to build that robustness in the system that if there are any climate or natural disaster risks, we're still able to kind of have functional power systems while addressing, of course, the losses, and while addressing the fact that because energy at its core is development. So access to energy, access to clean energy will be supremely important, especially as Pakistan's still developing. Pakistan is rapidly urbanizing, and its energy needs will only grow.
And I think it serves again, I just want to follow your point. I think it serves a dual purpose. Because the issue that we're facing, the balance of payment crisis, the lack of ability to pay for an import bill, is the fact that energy is one of our highest imports. We don't produce oil, we don't produce fossil fuels as such, and we're importing natural gas, whether that's petroleum, things, so on and so forth. And fossil fuels just by itself, it comprises 86% of primary commercial energy use. So by being able to really capitalize on that transition, we're, like I said, it serves dual purpose. We're cutting, our current account deficit, we are producing energy, and we have that ability to really invest in solar. And we're also transitioning towards, energy sources which are more environment friendly, which are more climate friendly.
And this is given the background that Pakistan has a worsening debt crisis. We also need to keep that in mind, that we don't want to kind of deteriorate our macroeconomic situation further. So recognizing the role of multilateral banks, recognizing the role of governments, I also think the private sector has a really big role to play. And Pakistan can incentivize the private sector more. The concessional financing that we get from these multilateral development banks and other financial institutions can be used to incentivize the private sector to come in and lower the cost in order to make renewable energy, for instance, the uptake of it be scalable. So that's also definitely something that we need to work on.
No, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out, because this is where I was heading towards next. People in Pakistan, and when I say people, I mean policymakers, the politicians, members of the civil, the bureaucracy, the military, they tend to really focus on the economic upheaval. That is the primary focus. What is where we're incapable of growth. Then we're targeting the opposition is targeting the government for high levels of inflation, increases in poverty. And climate change is now increasingly becoming an economic issue. We've just highlighted the numbers, but even beyond that, I think there's a real need to integrate climate policies into economic policies. Mainstreaming climate into our structural reforms. And you're trying to decarbonize. You're trying to capitalize. You're building resilience, embedding resilience. And how do you do that? It really begs the question. And here, I'd just like to weigh in based on some of the experience that I've done in terms of economic diversification models in various other countries and transitioning towards greener growth. The very first thing is, how do you incentivize, like you mentioned, the private sector? What would encourage the private sector to make that transition towards sectors which are more greener? And it all comes down to, the stick and the carrot approach. The imposition of carbon tax, recycling rebates, cap and trade mechanisms, such that it disincentivizes industries which are more carbon intensive, and tends to provide means of access to finance and access to markets, easing business entry for those sectors and firms associated with parts of sectors which are more greener. I will take the example of China, for instance. China is now increasingly becoming a global leader in battery manufacturing sector, and they're looking towards the future. that is not the need right now, but they've foreseen, they've already envisioned that by 2030, by 2040, the people, as they transcend, adopt, transform towards renewable energy, they need storage mechanisms. And energy battery storage is a form of industry, is a form of sector that is not only green and environment friendly, but it also serves as a huge potential for economic growth. And that is what is needed. We need to set up, create an enabling environment which is conducive for private sector development and encourages them to adapt to sectors which are more greener. Then another thing, and both Nimra and you've mentioned, is the water scarcity. Not just the water scarcity, the agricultural sector, the food, water, and agriculture nexus. Now, again, I have this number in front of me, and you'll be surprised. We claim that we're an agrarian economy, but Pakistan's agriculture water productivity is at the lowest docile globally. That is 37 cents per cubic meter. So basically, we're not optimizing our water resources, and we're not producing agricultural goods that are either feasible economically in terms of the revenue they're generating, and they're definitely detrimental to the climate. We're talking about wheat subsidy, we talk about sugar subsidies. Those are not very, growth conducive, good products. And then we look towards rice farming. It's a crop which is very water intensive. And Pakistan by 2030, apparently, and these are figures that I have read, very, very robust figures based on thorough research by experts in this field, Pakistan will only be able to sustain its share of agricultural water consumption by 2030. After that, if you want to consume, water in agriculture, you'll be taking it away from other areas. And the weakest of all are people, people who are already facing water shortages, whether that's in rural areas and whether that is in, major cities. So there's a huge potential to capitalize on the GDP growth and intersection of climate-friendly policies.
So
going further, yes, please.
Nauraiz, on agriculture, the agri-food system definitely needs to be transformed. And you mentioned that how it's not super efficient, it's not super productive. And in fact, the agricultural yields are expected to drop by 50% by 2050. So that's definitely a big cause of concern. But this sector is still so important because it's our largest employer, especially for the poor and vulnerable communities. So it's not just a sector that provides us with food, it's a sector that provides people with their livelihoods. So as this is diminishing in terms of returns, as our lands are getting degraded, as we're overusing the scarce water resources that we have, we're also putting those people at risk for, in fact, their livelihoods.
So basically, as a result of climate change, we are failing to come up with the right set of possibilities that would tend to kind of alleviate the burden on the people. Rather, on the other hand, we are accelerating the impact of climate change. We're making it even more adverse by the imposition of misadventures and mispolicies that are in place. On that note, I think when we talk about policymaking, there's a lot of emphasis on evidence-based, data-driven. So Nimra, coming back to you, you're leveraging data to design and implement Amazon-led reforms in terms of sustainability. What do you think? What are the areas where Pakistan is lacking in terms of climate-related data, or data related to water, food, urbanization, and how can we really leverage digitalization, technology, and data itself to help us aid in this transformation and in the design of effective policy?
Yeah, so I think Sundus and you, Nauraiz, you guys addressed this question yourselves previously, but of course, I guess there is an imminent need for policy analysts to start collecting, first of all. So let me take a step back and just mention that while I was looking at the WTI data set for Pakistan specifically, data sparsity would have to be kind of the highlight of my analysis. Unfortunately, there isn't enough data that we are collecting from regional sources, which is how the WTI is fed. Unfortunately, we just don't have the data. For example, I was trying to look at building a predictive model to look at precipitation in different regions of Pakistan. So as Sundus mentioned, right, we have the Indus River flowing from north to south. And of course, communities around that are more susceptible to flood damage. In the future as well, these rainfalls are going to get more and more intense. So I wanted to build that correlation. Unfortunately, the data was just missing. There was no data for the past 20 years. My time period that I was focusing on was 2000 to date. Unfortunately, data for 2022, 2021 still has not been updated in the system. So I think just going back and collecting this data is very important for policy analysts. And of course, once this data is collected and it's validated, we of course need to have more data-driven policies in place to curb climate change. I think some of the I guess key things that policy makers can start addressing is, of course, based on my analysis, controlling population growth. As you guys mentioned, switching to cleaner energy alternatives like solar, wind, invest in environmentally friendly fertilizers as well. Since we are an agrarian economy, we want to try and not release nitrogen into there as well. Reforestation across urban cities. We want to plan cities better by implementing zoning to allow for more greener zones to keep temperature in check. I guess the government should also subsidize zero-emission electric vehicles as they are doing across Europe, across other kind of developed nations. So those are some of the I would say, key things that come to mind by looking at the data that was available. But again, there's a lot more that could be done.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you for pointing that out. I think it is very imperative to make sure that we have the right data collection mechanisms in place for us to, analyze those and come up with some tangible policies. And just moving on just to the last leg of this discussion. And I find myself kind of repeating this again and again, but I really want to emphasize as much as I can that climate change, it's not just climate change. It's an economic issue. It's an humanitarian issue. The repercussions are disastrous. They're catastrophic. And at some point or the other, if the right measures are not taken, it will affect each and every one of us, whether, everyone residing through Pakistan. I know there are inter-country disparities, like Sundus mentioned, based on spatial differences, and there are intra-country disparities as well between some countries which are more vulnerable and some countries which are less. But there's no escape from it unless there's a timely response. And on that note, for the viewers and everyone who's listening into it, I would want you both to chime in. What can we do at the personal level, at the individual level? Obviously we need climate financing. We need this right set of policies. We need the governments to take responsibility. But as an individual, you do not want to just sit and wait and be at the mercy of, policymakers and funders, investors elsewhere. What can you do? So yeah, please, both of you.
I think as
Maybe.
individuals,
Please, yes.
We can think about how can we live our own life more sustainably, right? So if we're buying appliances, can we opt for energy efficient appliances? Can we reduce our water waste? Can we reduce generally our waste production? How many opportunities do we have to utilize public transport, to carpool as we go to work, etc.? One thing that I will highlight, especially noting that that's a particular vice of my friends and family, opt for a plant-based diet. We don't have to have meat as often as we do. It's not good for our health, and it's definitely not good for the environment. So if there's one thing that I will encourage people to do less of, is think again when you're having your next beef burger.
I hope it sits well with the Pakistani audience who are consuming this program and consuming meat.
That's a very good point, Sundus. I completely agree with all the points that you listed. I think something else that I would like to add is, which I feel is very personal to me, is that we want to try and start the process of recycling our waste. Maybe we can try and just compost our food waste that we produce. So just kind of sort out your plastic waste versus your food waste, maybe in your homes. Very simple to do. Use the food waste scrapes, throw them in your yard. That will actually help with your plantation, your vegetation, everything. So maybe opt for that. Of course, waste, like food waste, when you throw it in garbage trucks, it's going to be dumped into landfills, which will actually produce more methane, which will lead to warming of the planet even further. So maybe that's something we can try.
And there's just one more thing that just came to my mind and thinking out loud is I've witnessed in Pakistan, especially in the urban areas, that people tend to wash their transportation vehicles quite a lot. And one of the amplifiers of climate change is the use of non-agriculture water. And I think if we can cut down and not wash our cars or our bikes, every single day, that may really help. Because like I said, Pakistan's groundwater is depleting. It is making the climate change very much more pronounced, and it is also affecting our local environment. So maybe we can cut that off front too. I guess we've covered a lot. We've debunked a lot of myths as well. We've traced back as to what is causing climate change at the global level. How responsible Pakistan is. The policies in Pakistan can undertake not to maybe impact global climate change, but how to help improve the lives of its population and the citizens who are living within the confines of its boundary. And the last thing, I think, and a very important thing, is that while there's a correlation between GDP and carbon emissions, Pakistan can still capitalize on its growth potential without having to further intensify carbon emitting activities, and rather capitalize on decarbonization, building climate resilience, and adopting a human-centric approach. So thank you so much, both of you. It was a lovely discussion and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope our viewers did too.
Thank you, Nauraiz.
Thank you.